Good evening, folks, and welcome to the next session of apologetics for Aletheia. So this evening we're going to discuss the problem of evil as evidence for God's existence. And our friend and former apologetics co-host, Bob Kuligowski, is going to do that for us this evening. So take it away, Bob.
Former apologetics co-host. You may get fired after this.
Well,
anyway,
you still are remote apologetics co-host.
Even though I'm far away. Anyway, honest truth. The topic didn't. We didn't come up with this topic in light of recent events over the last couple of months, but this is kind of something that's always been a question with people. Evil things happen. We read about them in the papers, or they happen to us, or happen to people that care about us, and it causes a wrestling with the question of how can a good God allow bad things to happen? And what I want to do in this talk is first take a look at the problem of evil. And I'm going to try to give a rigorous philosophical definition of it, not to put everyone to sleep, but so that I'm not attacking a straw man argument. I want to make sure that I'm addressing the problem of evil as it is properly presented. I'll then talk about the dilemma that the problem of evil actually presents for atheists, but I also want to talk about the trilemma, which is a three-way dilemma that it presents for theists and Christians. It doesn't, believers in Christ are not let off the hook by this argument. And then kind of summarize things at the end. So let's start with the question, what is the problem of evil? And I've linked below the source I use for this. This is from Stanford University, from their philosophy department. So they will, at least I assume it's their philosophy department since the server is called Plato. But I have taken what was a whole bunch of text and rendered it in graphic format, so you can blame that on me rather than on them. But basically starts out with that if God exists, then God has to have certain characteristics or certain qualities. And they focus on three of them in the problem of evil. And the reason for those three will become apparent momentarily. First one, or one of them, is that he's omnipotent. He's all powerful. He can do anything that power is able to accomplish. Second is that he's omniscient, or all-knowing, that he knows everything past, present, and future. And the third is that if God exists, he has to be morally perfect. And the definition that's typically used in the problem of evil is that morally perfect entails the desire to eliminate all evil. So the upshot of these things, if God's omnipotent, that means he has the ability or the power to eliminate all evil. So the omniscience part means that he knows when evil exists. So he knows where and when it is, and he has the ability to get rid of it. And moral perfection, as defined here, implies he also has the desire to eliminate all evil. So God wants to do it. He knows where to find it, and he is able to do what needs to be done to get rid of it, which is all fine and dandy, except that we live in a world where evil exists. And this creates a problem, because in that case, it seems at first blush that these things can't all be true about God. Maybe God's not omnipotent. Maybe he knows everything. He knows where evil exists, and he wants to get rid of it, but he can't do it. There's a limit to what he can do. Maybe he's not omniscient. Maybe he has the ability to eliminate all evil. Maybe he wants to, but he just doesn't know where and when all of it is. Or the most frightening one is that maybe he's not morally perfect. Maybe he can get rid of evil. Maybe he knows where it all is, but he doesn't want to. And the problem of evil conundrum concludes that since of these three characteristics of God, at least one of them must be false if evil exists, then the conclusion is that God doesn't exist. That is, in a nutshell, how the problem of evil works. Sometimes it can be put in simpler forms, but this I wanted to give, again, a very rigorous one, so I'm not creating a straw man. So where does the dilemma come in if you're an atheist? If you draw this conclusion that God doesn't exist because of bad things in the world? The hinge point of this is the premise that evil exists, because this is everything with the diagram we saw previously is hunky-dory until we pop in that part in the bottom that evil exists. But before we can get to analyzing evil, we first have to understand the idea of objective versus subjective truth. And I'm not, I'm trying to synthesize this in a way that's easily understandable. This is not meant to be philosophy 401 or whatever. But objective truth is truth that exists outside the mind. And you can get this from the Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary. So it's based on facts that can be proven. For instance, universal gravitation says that objects attract each other with a force that's proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the distance between them. All the wonderful equations, or at least some of them, are on the right-hand side. But the point is that gravity, the law, universal gravitation existed before Isaac Newton allegedly got hit in the head with an apple. It existed before anybody understood any of these concepts. So universal gravitation is objective. Its truth doesn't depend on people understanding it or knowing about it or believing it's true. It's just there. It's a fact of the universe. The other type of truth is subjective truth. And this refers to, again, same source of definition, refers to ideas, feelings, or experiences. These are things that exist in somebody's mind rather than the outside world. Another way of describing them are matters of taste. For instance, I personally think the beef heart soup is delicious. Sadly, my family does not share that belief with me, and therefore my wife made it once, and that was the last time she made it. But that, the fact that I think beef heart soup is delicious doesn't make it delicious in any kind of an objective fashion. Other people don't feel that way about it. Or to say that, the New York Mets are the best team, which is certainly not true right now. To say that, ice cream is the best dessert. To say that it's better to be rich than it is to be tall, or things like that. Those are all matters of opinion. There's no, there is not a universal aspect of this that's true everywhere at every time. So let me give it an example. Who would we call tall, or how do we define tall? For instance, would someone who's 6'5", so it'd be, I guess, 1.95 m or so for the metrically inclined, would you call that person tall? And I think most people here, I can't see you, so I don't know how tall you are. I'm 6 feet. I would call that tall. The gentleman in the picture on the right, if you look at the ruler he's standing next to, is about 6 feet 5 inches tall. By my definition, he'd be tall. Standing next to him is a wax figure of Robert Wadlow, who was the tallest independently verified human in recent history, of which there's irrefutable medical evidence. He was measured at 8 feet 11.1 inches tall. He sadly died at the age of 22 back in 1940. But he would not have considered someone who's 6'5" to be tall. I mean, even a lot of NBA players would look at somebody 6'5" and like, what big, been there, done that. So it depends on perspective. How about 6 feet? One conversation I've had with my wife more than once is when we meet some people and we're talking about who we met at a church community group or a party or whatever, and she talks about the tall guy. And when I hear the tall guy, I'm expecting someone who's like 6'3", 6'4", and I can't recall anybody who's that tall. And so I can't figure out who it is. And then she gives me more description, and I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but I don't consider him to be tall. So the challenge is, and 5'6". If you're 5 feet, someone who's 5'6" is tall. I don't consider that to be tall. The definition of tall usually depends on the person's own height. Typically, people who are taller than you are tall, and people who are shorter than you than short. But it's subjective. There's no objective measure. There's no objective standard for tall. The National Institute of Science of Standards Technology hasn't come up with a definition, so we can't objectively evaluate people's heights using the word tall. Now, we can using various measurements, feet, inches, centimeters, furlongs, whatever, that are objective measures, that are objectively, there's an objective standard, but we can't use the word tall or short to necessarily express someone's height in a way that's meaningful, because we all have different things in mind when we hear the word tall or the word short. So it's, again, subjective. Same is true for morals. If you don't have an objective standard of morality, then you can't define evil in a way that everyone would agree on, just as you can't define tall in a way that everybody's going to agree on. So let's unpack this a little bit more. So to call anything evil is similar to calling someone tall. You measure, or to say, for instance, someone is 6'3". To determine if to call someone, say if someone's 6'3", you stand them up against the wall, you have a ruler next to them, and you look at the top of their head compared to the ruler. And that ruler is an objective standard that was decided by NIST or whomever. And we can do the same with people's actions, that if we're going to call something evil, we have to have some kind of an objective moral standard of it. And we also have to determine if we're going to call it evil, that it violates that standard. Just as, again, if someone if suddenly tall was officially defined as 6'3", and someone stands next to the ruler and they're 6 foot, sorry, you're not tall. You are not tall by the subjective agreed upon standard. But the other problem is, if you don't have an objective moral standard, saying that something is evil is ultimately saying that is the same as saying you don't like it. I realize that sounds, that may sound crass at first, but things become a matter of taste. I don't like murder. Doesn't have any more obligation than anybody else than saying I don't like eggplant. It's a matter of opinion. But that opinion I have no obligations, or it has no bearing on me. I may choose to agree with you. I may choose to disagree with you. And even if people do agree on something, subjective assessments don't establish truths about objective reality. Even if everybody agreed that eggplant was disgusting, it wouldn't make eggplant would still be a subjective truth. It would not be an objective truth about reality. So you have to, in order for the statement evil exists to be objectively true and not just a matter of opinion, you have to have an objective moral standard. There has to be some moral standard that is independent of human minds, that exists, always has existed, and would continue to exist even if humanity disappeared, or even if everybody said, no, I want to do things a different way. So then we call the grounding problem. How can we objectively ground morality? How can we ground morality in such a way that we not only can agree upon it, but that we're obligated to do it? Can we ground it in ourselves? And we've already seen no. It's the same thing as the height, as the tall example. It's subjective. Anything that's objectively true about reality is going to be true, even if no one agrees with it. I mean, for many, many, many years, people didn't know germs existed. And in the latter half of the 19th century, there was a very strong disagreement between American physicians and European physicians about the existence of microscopic beings. And it is possible that James Garfield lost his life because the Americans were wrong about that one. So those germs were there in James Garfield's body, and they were being put there by the unwashed hands of his doctors, even though his doctors were unaware of it. The existence of those germs was an objective truth, even though they didn't believe it. Maybe we can't ground it ourselves. Can we ground it in other objective truths about material reality? In other words, can we get other things about the world, the universe, that are objective, and use those as a grounding for morality? And the question then is, what will we use? Universal gravitation, the laws of thermodynamics. Again, I'm not trying to be crass, but the point is, what is there that's out there that we could use to do this? What objective truths are there that we could possibly use to derive morality? And the first answer a lot of people are going to ask is, what about evolution? Could we say that we evolved to have certain predispositions about certain activities? But there's a couple of problems with that. One is that even if widely held moral preferences actually, were the product of evolution of natural selection, they'd still be subjective. They wouldn't be objective. In other words, if we quote unquote evolved to believe murder is wrong, that means that murder wasn't wrong until the point in which, humans or whoever evolved, quote unquote, this concept of murder being wrong. It would still be subjective. It would still be mind dependent. And let's be honest, anybody who's watched Animal Planet, or if you're old like me, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, knows there's a lot of behaviors in the non-human natural world that are not desirable human behaviors. Creatures eating each other, creatures doing all kinds of things to each other. And I'm not sure that's really where we want to go for this. So what else? Is it possible, even if we can't derive morality from an existing objective truth, could we say that morality is a natural law? Similar to, again, universal gravitation, second law of thermodynamics, so on and so forth. But this has other problems. And the big one is that natural laws are of a different kind than moral laws. And Raman and Caitlin have heard my rant about how I wish we didn't use the word natural laws because it creates confusion. So what's the difference? Natural laws simply describe behavior. Natural laws describe gravity. The universal gravitation doesn't make my keys fall out of on the floor when I drop them. It just describes that it will happen and the rate of acceleration of the keys as they hit the ground. There's no ought to about it. There's no gravity police who are going to, look at my keys when I drop them to make sure they fall, or going to, look at a pot of water that's 100 degrees Celsius to make sure it boils. It's not an obligation. Whereas moral laws prescribe behavior and they involve obligations. One example, the DC Beltway, speed limit signs, speed limit is 55 miles an hour. That certainly does not describe the behavior that occurs on the Beltway. It's a prescription. It's an obligation. It's an obligation almost nobody follows, but it's a different, the law of speed limit 55 is very different from a natural law. And for the philosophy geeks out there, category error is the technical term of what you're doing when you're trying to compare two things that aren't alike. That even though we use the word law, they mean two very different things. But let's dig in a little bit more, because the obligations that are implied in moral laws make things interesting. Because an obligation, as in, an ought to, they're only between people who have free will. Objects can't make obligations on someone. My house cannot impose an obligation on me to scrub the floors once a week. My grass can't impose an obligation on me to mow it every week. This Johnson City can do that because they're people. But that whenever you have obligations, you always have persons involved and you have free will, because again, an obligation is an ought to. So the person, the one who's obligated has to be somebody with free will, because they have a choice. Rocks don't have a choice whether to fall or not; they just do, and that's how the law of universal gravitation works. The other part with obligations, it's not just any person's, but obligations are backed by authority. If I put up a sign in front of my house saying the speed limit is 10 miles an hour. Nobody's obligated to drive 10 miles an hour just because I put a sign up there. But if, Johnson City, Tennessee, where I live, if they put a sign up there at 10 miles an hour, you better believe that you're obligated to drive 10 miles an hour there. So it's not just a matter of having two persons involved, but also one of those people has to be an authority over the other. So a law is basically an obligation of a person or persons to the persons in authority over them, whether the law is about speed limits, taxes, whatever you name it. That's ultimately your law. There's an obligation of you should do this. You are capable of doing other. I'm certainly capable of driving more than 55 on the Beltway. But, the difference between what you can do and what you should do. Whereas again, for, natural laws, it's what they do. There is no should do. This is what they do. And to kind of spread it out a little bit more, contracts are basically another form of obligations between people, but they're enforced by the people in authority over them. That when two people make an agreement where A is going to give something to B and B to A, and if neither one's an authority over the other, but if one of them tries to break the contract, then they go to then the law gets involved. So why am I going into all of this? You'll see in a moment as we unpack this argument. So in order for objective evil, so again, I'm talking about an evil that's meaningful, that's objective. It's not just a matter of opinion. It's not an I don't like this. It is this is objectively wrong. This is wrong for everybody, all the time, everywhere, regardless of what they think about it. In order for that kind of evil to exist, objective morality has to exist. But if objective morality exists, but you can't ground it in the material universe, and we said can't ground it in us, can't extrapolate from natural phenomena, and we can't extrapolate, can't get at it from evolution, can't get at it from some other, thinking it's something analogous to universal gravitation, then it has to be grounded outside the material universe. This is the excluded middle principle of logic. It's either inside or outside. There's nowhere else it could have come from other than those two choices. And again, I said objective morality prescribes behavior rather than describing it. It consists of obligations, ought tos, rather than this is how things happen. And that those obligations can only be imposed by persons with free will and authority over persons with free will under their authority. So if objective evil exists, then humans must be under the authority of a person outside the material universe. There must have been a person who imposes these obligations upon the persons inside the material universe. And y'all can probably see this coming from a mile away, but humor me. Are other conclusions possible? They've been made. But the most reasonable conclusion as to the nature of this person outside of the material universe is that he's God. And definition from dictionary.com is the eternal, infinite spirit, mind, or other transcendent entity that is the creator or ultimate source of the universe and that rules or orders it. So the prime mover, the intelligent being who created the universe and also has imposed obligations upon it. Now, most reasonable, meaning better supported by other lines of evidence than the alternatives, like a created non-material being, for instance. So, in order for objective morality to exist, God has to exist. If God doesn't exist, then the statement evil exists is false because there is no objective moral standard, therefore there could be no evil, and the whole problem of evil argument falls apart. So a summary for the dilemma for the atheist is that, and the dilemma is a situation where you have a choice between two equally undesirable alternatives. The first undesirable alternative is that an objective moral standard exists. Because if that's the case, then, as I showed in the previous pages, God must exist because God is the only logical explanation for an objective moral standard. We tried the other ones, they've been found wanting. The other is that there is no objective moral standard, but in that case, there's no basis for making objective moral judgments about God or anyone else. Again, to say that murder is wrong has the same weight as saying, I don't like eggplant. It's just a matter of personal opinion that doesn't have any bearing on anyone else's obligations. So to summarize, the problem of evil, if God exists, he's got to be omnipotent. He can get rid of all evil. Omniscient. He knows where the evil is. And he's morally perfect. He wants to get rid of all of it. But the problem is that the existence of evil means one of these three, at least, maybe two, maybe all three, can't be true. You cannot have all of them. And that leads to the conclusion that there's no God. But we see the short circuit that if God doesn't exist, there's no evil, and this whole argument falls apart. That you're starting with a presupposition that ultimately requires God to not exist in order to conclude that God doesn't exist. So we talked about the dilemma for atheists, but theists aren't off the hook on this one, because all I've done is explain why you can't use this argument to explain why God doesn't exist. But we still got a problem, because remember, this is the problem. We're saying that evil existing means one of these three qualities, omnipotent, omniscient, or morally perfect, God cannot possess that in order for evil to exist. God either has to not be able to get rid of the evil, or he has to be ignorant of some of it, or he has to not want to get rid of it. And so, for those of us who are theists or Christians, we're in a bit of a pickle. How do we get out of this? And my argument is that the flaw is, oh, one sec. Sorry, I forgot about this part. The trilemma, and a trilemma is just a dilemma with three equally undesirable alternatives. My apologies, I forgot I had this slide. That, again, we got to reject at least one of three aspects of God. Either God's not omnipotent, which means we can't rely on him to help us. He's not omniscient, which means we can't rely on him to know that we need help. Or he's not morally perfect, which means at the very least we can't completely trust him. At the worst, we're at the mercy of a cruel despot. So, those of you who are either engineering majors or have been in the world of engineering or the world of project management know that, fast, good, cheap, pick two. You cannot have all three. And that is kind of where it feels like we are with this. Which of the two or one are we going to, and again, if we don't have all three, where does this leave what we understand about God? So my argument is that the third of these, the morally perfect, in the way it is defined, is flawed. And because of that definition, I think the flaw in the definition leads to an incorrect conclusion. Again, this is not my making a straw man. This is the way it's defined, that God and morally perfect means he wants to eliminate all evil, all of it. But what if moral perfection does not imply or does not entail that God's going to immediately remove all evil if it accomplishes a greater good? There are examples of these choices that we have to make in our world or that other people do all the time. Amputation of limbs. Now, it's a lot better than it used to be. I've been to some Civil War sites where, back in the day when a saw and whiskey were the two tools that were used, and the saw was for the surgeon and the whiskey was for the patient. But, maiming somebody accomplished a greater good of saving their lives. It may seem primitive to us now, but even still, amputations happen. There's times when your limb is so damaged that if you don't get rid of it, it will cost you your life. Chemotherapy. I mean, haven't been through it. I have had friends who did, and it is everything I've read about. It's awful. The hair loss, the nausea, the whole ball of wax. I mean, it is something you wouldn't normally think about inflicting on somebody, but it accomplishes the greater good, at least you hope, of saving their lives. Another one is warfare. I mean, we have now, we have precision weapons, which can basically look up people's mailing addresses, knock on their front door. But a couple generations ago, especially, there were a lot of instances where a lot of innocent civilians died, and it was accepted because the greater good of saving a greater number of lives. I mean, one of the things people don't talk about for D-Day, the invasion of Normandy during World War II, is that during the Allied bombardment leading up to it immediately afterward, the estimate is that somewhere between 10 and 20,000 French civilians were killed in the bombings leading to D-Day. That's horrible. There is no whitewashing this, and I'm not trying to. And I'm not trying to say that all of this, that this kind of stuff in warfare is always justified. This is not an end justifies the means type of thing. But that if that had not been done, way more Allied soldiers would probably have been killed. And maybe the invasion of Europe wouldn't have happened then or happened later, and Hitler would have had the opportunity to exterminate even more Jews than he did already. So it's, again, one of those things where it's an evil, and and the killing of civilians, there's no way to put it. People lost their dads, they lost their moms, they lost their kids. But it ultimately accomplished a greater good or avoided an even greater evil, depending on how you want to think about it. We see this in Scripture as well. I mean, one example that's very blunt is in Genesis. when Joseph, not Joseph, the father of Jesus, but Joseph, the son of Jacob, his brothers hate him. They decide to sell him into slavery. And through a long trail of 14 years of different circumstances, he ends up becoming the second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. Pharaoh has a dream. Joseph interprets it, and the dream means you're going to have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, so you better save things up. Joseph tells Pharaoh this, instructs Pharaoh to build these silos for all this grain, and it ends up saving not only the people of Egypt, but also Joseph's brothers, the ones who threw him, who sold him into slavery, in order to it saved them from famine as well. And the Joseph said this flat out in Genesis 50:20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And just, imagining again with just the terror that he must have experienced, being thrown in the pit, not knowing if his brothers are going to kill him, then finding out they weren't, but they were going to sell him to slavery, into a place where he'd be a slave possibly for the rest of his life, would never see his family again. And yet God used this to accomplish a greater good. And more modern times, a verse that I memorized, and it still makes my teeth hurt. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith develops endurance. And let endurance have a perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. What are trials? Trials aren't hangnails and somebody taking my favorite parking spot. Trials are evil committed against me. Sometimes small things like insults, sometimes big things like the loss of relationship or physical harm. And that even these things that are evil, that God uses for good purpose. And the biggest one was Good Friday. Jesus Christ was of the sinless Son of God. He had never done anything wrong, and yet he was punished for the sins of all humanity in order to redeem us from sin. That incredible, mind-blowing injustice was what God used to redeem his people from sin. Another thing that we need to recalibrate as we consider this is our understanding of the word good, because I think even for Christians, we often have an idea of good that is conditioned more by our culture than by scripture. Because the question, how is God defined good? Because that's what matters. I mean, it's his world. He made everything. He has the right to define it. And ultimately, I think it's defined out of his character, not by fiat, but that's a completely different talk. Oops, hang on. And so as defined, Matthew 22:37-40, Jesus summarizes the entire law. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. The great and foremost commandment, the first one. And he says the second is like it. You shall love your neighbors yourself. On these two commandments depend the law and the whole law and the prophets. And we look at the 10 commandments. The first 4 commandments, I only do the first 3, but the first 4, it's the Sabbath, but they're all totally God-centric. We do get the don't covet, don't cheat on your spouse, don't steal stuff in the second half. But the first half, the front end, the most important part of the 10 commandments is all about properly relating to God. It is all about him. So we see that God makes it clear there and elsewhere in Scripture that his being recognized for who he is. Glory is the term we use for it, but I don't always like it because we normally think of glory and it doesn't really capture it. This recognizing who God is, recognizing the truth about who he is the ultimate good. Now, human flourishing is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that God doesn't care, but it's subordinate to it. And again, if God really is who he says he is, if he is really the creator and sustainer of the entire universe, and we are, 8 billion, finite creatures on this little pebble in, orbiting one of 100 billion stars in 100 billion galaxies, it's not reasonable to think it's about us. It is eminently reasonable to think that it is about God. Because when we make human flourishing especially outside the context of God, the ultimate good, it takes God out from his rightful place. It means it makes it about us rather than about him. And that's not the way the Bible works. But our own sin nature, our own propensity for self-centeredness, and our own culture condition us to do this. I mean, all advertisement is, the whole purpose of advertisement is to make you feel good about yourself so that you can, so they can, the advertiser can help themselves to the contents of your wallet. That's all it is. So let's look a little more deeply at this standard. Romans 9, which is, I know, everyone's favorite chapter in Scripture. So then God has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault, for who resists as well? Which is a good question. And Paul's answer is entirely unsatisfying. On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing that molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it? Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use? Again, God has that right. But what if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? In other words, what if God allowed evil to accomplish a greater good? And he did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. And even there we see this statement of God allowing evil in order to accomplish a greater good. So where do we go from here? This should make you uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable because it tells me God is way bigger than we ever gave him credit for. It's the whole thing of, of C.S. Lewis, Aslan. Aslan isn't safe. So, does this mean that we're God's toys to amuse himself with? Are we just pieces on a chessboard, and when the game is over, God puts the chessboard away and we get thrown back in the box? There are people who think that way, who see God that way. And if so, how could you ever genuinely love and worship a God like that? If we really don't mean anything to him, how could we? And there are people who are, atheists or non-Christians who ask that very question. And it's legit. It's a good question. But we have to remember, just because God's glory is his first priority, it doesn't mean human flourishing doesn't matter. And it certainly doesn't mean God's opposed to it. I mean, that is the lie of the Garden of Eden. That's the lie the serpent told Eve, that, God lied to you about what this fruit was. He's holding out on you that you need to disobey God in order to do what's best for you. And of course they did. They listened to the serpent and the world broke, and here we are. And furthermore, if we go back to that quote from Matthew, when Jesus talked about the first and second commandments, the greatest commandment and the second one, if God's glory and human flourishing were really opposed to each other, how could Jesus say that the command to love your neighbors yourself is like the command to love God? Loving others is loving God when God is the ultimate context. And that the juxtaposition of these commands to love God and others shows that serving God is what leads to true human flourishing. Obeying him is what leads to true human flourishing, because we're living in the real context of reality. God is our creator and us as creatures. We're not living in the false context that we're the center of the universe, which again, even if you're a materialist atheist, doesn't make any sense. 8 billion of us, one of 100 billion stars and one of 100 billion galaxies. What makes you think we're all that? But the most definitive evidence is the cross. If we're just God's toys to amuse himself with, how do we explain the cross? Again, there's no rational basis to argue that God's obligated to save anyone. The superior is not obligated to the inferior. The king is not obligated to his subjects. God made us and we're obligated to him, not the other way around. So he has the right to determine what our obligations are to him. And I believe those obligations are based on his character. They're not just something he did by fiat. But we've consistently violated those obligations, and yet he saved us, not by ignoring his own obligations, not by looking the other way on evil, but by having his own son pay the penalty for violating God's character, for telling the cosmic lie that God is not the creator and Lord of everything. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. As C.S. Lewis said, Aslan isn't safe, but he's good. So what does this all mean for us? Evil exists. Objective evil exists. And in Scripture, God defines it and explains its presence. Not only its presence in terms of the fall, that if evil came into the world because Adam and Eve rebelled and we're struggling through the consequences, but also why God allows it to continue even though he could stop it anytime he wants. He is looking to achieve a greater good. Do we always understand what the greater good is? No. There's time. There are many things that have happened that I have absolutely no clue how God's going to use it for good, but that's okay. God gave me my mind. That means it's a sure bet God is more creative than I am. I mean, he made the whole stinking universe. He's more creative than I am. He will ultimately make everything right. So when we are affected by evil, we can hope in two foundational promises. One is God's justice. Either those who did the evil are going to pay for it, or Jesus is going to pay for it. It will, the scales will balance someday, and it's not our job to do that. Now, governments exist to do that, per se, Romans 13, even though they carried out imperfectly. So God has made some provision for a certain amount of justice to be carried out now, but ultimately, even there, as much as governments do, and even when they do it quote unquote perfectly according to the law, scales don't balance. Putting somebody in the electric chair doesn't bring back the family member who that person murdered. Let's be honest. But the scales one day will be balanced. Either those who did it will pay for it, or Jesus has paid for it. The other promise we have, besides justice, is in God's sustaining grace in the here and now. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. That God has said we can be content with what we have because God has promised never will he leave us, never will he forsake us. We don't always know what that grace is going to look like. Granted, sometimes he lets us know, sometimes he doesn't. But it's always going to be there when we need it. And many times we get worried because we don't know what it's going to be, but we're not in the situation yet. So in summary, it's often argued that the presence of evil in the world is evidence that God does not exist. That because an omnipotent knows everything, omnipotent can do anything power can do, omniscient knows everything, morally perfect God would not allow any evil, and therefore doesn't exist. The problem for the atheist is that in order to make the statement evil exists, you need an objective grounding for it. Otherwise, the statement has about the same grounding as for me to say that mint should not be in food other than chocolate chip mint ice cream, which I've taken a liking to. Mint chocolate chip ice cream. So the only way you can have an objective grounding for morals, and thus an objective grounding for evil, is if God exists. But it still doesn't solve the problem for the theist, because we're still stuck. Okay, God's there, but we still don't understand how does omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect fit in with the notion there's evil in the world. And that the way to move forward in that is to examine this assumption that a morally perfect God would want to immediately remove all evil. And trust that in the fallen world we live in, God allows it because it accomplishes a greater good than if the evil were eliminated immediately. God says it in Scripture. We don't always know what that looks like. Sometimes he gives us a glimpse into it. Sometimes he doesn't. And we also have to challenge our own assumption that good is defined by us, what fulfills me, what makes me happy, what makes me comfortable, instead of being centered on God and remembering who we are, that we are loved deeply by him, yes, but we're not, ultimately it is not all about us. I like the way that Francis Chan put it, that we're It's as if we're bit players in a movie where we show up for 5 seconds in the crowd scene and then we conclude the movie's all about us. Anyway, that is it. Any questions or discussion? And I will stop sharing my screen just so I can see what's going on.
So just before we go ahead with that, is everybody comfortable with being recorded? Because the plan will be to record this and put it onto YouTube. So please let me know if that's going to be an issue for anyone. If not, we will go ahead.
We have nodding and thumbs up so far.
You mean this is going on YouTube?
Yep.
Oops. All right. Any questions? Have anything come up in the chat that I should know about first? Oh, yes, I really missed the Beltway. No, I don't miss not looking at Google Maps before I go anywhere. Any other questions besides that? If you haven't heard, I'm in Johnson City, Tennessee.
Can we get access to these slides? Because we want to take notes, but it was going fast. So we
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Raman, I'll work on getting a set of slides to you. I don't know if there's a way we can link it, we'll figure out a way to do it, or I can just put it up on Google. I can just put it on Google and put a link out to it. But we'll definitely make those available.
Yeah, we can certainly make those available.
Thank you.
And have it linked through the church newsletter.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for taking your time to do that. It was very helpful.
You're welcome. Raman's the one who does all the technical stuff. So yeah.
Raman, thank you.
I just run my mouth and ramble.
Well, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
All the way from College Park, if you can see.
Yep.
Maybe I should do it.
Yep. Okay, Naditya mentioned, that Bible is definitely not silent about evil. And I totally agree that I think it's very easy to fall into this. Even if you're not into prosperity gospel, it's just very easy to get in this idea of, the Bible, that if I follow all the rules and I do everything and follow the recipe, that everything's going to go exactly the way that I want it to. It's like, let me introduce you to a guy named Paul and a guy named Jeremiah. No.
So I've sort of discussed this topic with some of my friends before, and one thing that came up is like if God has this goal of first keeping himself glorified and then human flourishing, why wouldn't he have created a world where both are like always satisfied completely? And like even through our free will, we wouldn't choose to do any of that because God like knows everything. All our choices, like he knows what we're going to choose. So why wouldn't he create a world where we're not going to choose any evil? And we would always do that.
It's a good question, and I haven't found a satisfactory answer. There are some who have posited the argument that without free will, with unlimited choices, that true love is not possible, which I can certainly see in the sense that love doesn't mean as much when it's the only thing you can do. You basically become a robot. I'm just still not entirely satisfied with the answer. I mean, there's some people who are way smarter than me that have posited it, but there's just still something which I can't put my finger on.
Because like even if that's the case, like it's kind of similar with the world that we do live in. Mm-hmm. Just there is evil in it.
Yep. And the world was originally created where human flourishing and God's, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be, and then sin broke it. And I mean, again, God's purposes, his largest purposes, are very much in line with human flourishing. He wants us to, but part of it is our flourishing can't be divorced from the context of who he is. That we can't really flourish without God because we are living with a false assumption about, ultimately, our most basic assumption about the nature of reality is false. And even if we accidentally get some stuff right beyond that, there's a bunch of stuff we're going to get wrong.
Right. That makes sense.
I mean, in one sense, it's comforting that we haven't figured this all out, because if we had, it'd be easiest for us to wonder if we made all this up.
Yeah, that's true.
But the fact that there's so many things that, and even certain things in the Gospels that Jesus says, like, I don't understand. It's like, but why would someone make up something this weird or this embarrassing? Other questions or thoughts? Thank you all for attending. I'm glad we were able to do this. Raman, thank you for suggesting this. I'm glad for the tech that enables us to do these kinds of things.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And yes, and a big thank you to Bob. So
Yeah,
we
thank you
will
guys.
be having another one next month, which will be on exotheology. So what does it mean if aliens exist, and how do we relate to that as Christians? So I'll be giving that talk
Yep.
next month.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, thank you very much, Bob. If you could just stay on the line for a minute.
Absolutely.